Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with frost covering the windows of the schoolhouse, and Margaret's breath visible in the thin mountain air. She had arrived early to light the pot-bellied stove and arrange the desks one final time, trying to create an environment that would encourage learning rather than chaos. Her hands shook slightly as she wrote the date on the blackboard, though whether from cold or nerves, she couldn't say. By 8 o'clock, children began arriving in small groups. First came the Morrison twins, clean and properly dressed, followed by the Henderson girl whose father worked the general store. Then, a few more stragglers, children of miners and trappers who had been scrubbed as clean as mountain water and harsh soap could manage. They filed in quietly, taking seats and watching Margaret with curious eyes. By 8:30, there were 12 children present, ranging in age from 6 to 14. All well-behaved, all clearly coached by their parents on proper school behavior. Margaret began to relax. Perhaps the horror stories about mountain children had been exaggerated. Then, she heard them coming. The sound started as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling down the mountainside. But it grew louder and more chaotic with each passing moment. Shouting, laughing, what sounded like someone singing at the top of their lungs, and underneath it all, the thunder of multiple horses moving fast. The children already in the classroom exchanged knowing looks. Mary Morrison actually scooted her desk away from the door. "The Mackenzies are coming," she whispered to her twin brother, and he nodded gravely. Margaret straightened her shoulders and smoothed her skirts. She had dealt with difficult children before during her volunteer work at the church nursery. How bad could 9 children be? The answer, she discovered 30 seconds later, was worse than she had ever imagined. The first one through the door was a boy who looked to be about 16, tall and lanky with dark hair that stuck up in all directions and clothes that appeared to have been slept in. He burst through the entrance like he owned the place, looked around the room with a cocky grin, and announced loudly, well, looks like they found us another teacher to torture." Behind him came what could only be described as a stampede. 8 more children poured through the door in various stages of dishevelment, talking and laughing and completely ignoring Margaret's existence. The youngest, a boy who couldn't have been more than 6, was riding piggyback on one of the older girls, whooping like a wild Indian. 2 of the middle children appeared to be wrestling while walking, knocking over a chair as they scuffled past. "That's enough," Margaret said sharply, using the voice that had always worked with the church children. The Mackenzie children ignored her completely. They scattered to different parts of the room like marbles spilled from a bag. The oldest boy slouched into a desk in the back corner and put his feet up. 2 of the girls began an animated conversation about something they had seen on the ride to town. The youngest boy started playing with the chalk, drawing squiggly lines on any surface he could reach. Margaret tried again, louder this time. "Children, please take your seats." This time, the oldest boy looked at her with amused brown eyes. "Who made you the boss lady?" The question caught Margaret off guard. In her experience, children simply accepted adult authority without question. But these children had clearly been living by different rules. "I am Miss Thompson, your new teacher," she said, moving to stand in front of the room. "And I expect you to show proper respect for education and learning." One of the middle boys, maybe 10 years old, snorted with laughter. "Education? What's that going to teach us? How to starve to death with style." Several of the other children laughed at this, and Margaret felt her first flutter of real panic. She had prepared lessons, organized supplies, planned activities designed to engage reluctant learners. But she had not prepared for children who seemed to have no concept of basic classroom behavior. "We'll start with introductions," she said, trying to regain control. "Would each of you please stand, state your name, and tell us one thing you're looking forward to learning this year." The oldest boy made an exaggerated groaning sound. "Oh, this is going to be painful." But, to Margaret's surprise, one of the girls in the middle of the pack actually stood up. She was maybe 12 years old, with the same dark hair as her brothers, but cleaner clothes and a slightly less wild expression. "I'm Catherine Mackenzie," she said politely. "I'd like to learn to read better, so I can help the little ones with their letters." Margaret felt a surge of hope. At least one of them seemed willing to cooperate. "Thank you, Catherine. That's a wonderful goal." But before Margaret could call on the next child, The boy Catherine had been wrestling with earlier jumped up on his desk and announced, "I'm Daniel Mackenzie, and I'd like to learn how to blow things up with dynamite, like the miners do." This brought cheers from several of his siblings and horrified looks from the other children in the room. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but another Mackenzie boy was already on his feet. "I'm Patrick, and I want to learn how to shoot a bear from 100 yards away." "I'm Mary Beth," called one of the younger girls, "and I want to learn how to make whiskey like Uncle Pete." "I'm James," said another boy, "and I want to learn which berries will make you sick enough to miss chores." By now, the non-Mackenzie children were pressed as far away from the chaos as possible, and Margaret was beginning to understand why the previous teacher had fled. These children weren't just undisciplined. They were actively resistant to the entire concept of formal. The train to Millbrook was nothing like the comfortable passenger cars Margaret had imagined. It was a freight train with a single passenger car attached at the back, filled with miners, trappers, and other rough men heading into the mountains for work or winter shelter. The seats were hard wooden benches, and the car reeked of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and something else Margaret couldn't identify but suspected might be whiskey. She kept her eyes down and her hands folded tightly around her carpetbag, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. The other passengers paid her little attention at first, but as the train climbed higher into the mountains and the group grew smaller with each stop, she became more noticeable. A woman traveling alone was unusual enough, but a woman traveling alone to a place like Millbrook was practically unheard of. "You got family up there, miss?" asked a grizzled man across the aisle. His clothes were patched and dirty, but his eyes were kind. Margaret hesitated. "Mississippi." Not Mrs. She would have to get used to that again. "No," she said quietly. "No family." The man frowned. "Millbrook ain't no place for a woman on her own. Nothing up there but played-out mines and men who ain't seen civilization in months. You sure you got the right stop?" She wasn't sure of anything anymore, but she nodded anyway. "I'm sure." As the train wound its way through mountain passes and pine forests, Margaret pressed her face to the window and watched the landscape change. The comfortable farmland around Denver gave way to rocky foothills, then to steep mountainsides covered in aspen trees that glowed golden in the afternoon sun. It was beautiful, but also intimidating in its vastness. She had never been anywhere so remote, so far from everything familiar. The air grew thinner as they climbed, and Margaret found herself slightly breathless. The train moved slowly now, the engine working hard to pull them up the steep grades. Other passengers dozed or played cards, but Margaret couldn't relax. With each mile, she was moving further from the possibility of changing her mind and going back. Not that she could go back. Edwin had made that impossible. By now, Clara Henderson and her children were probably settled into Margaret's kitchen, eating dinner at Margaret's table, sleeping in Margaret's bed. The thought made her stomach clench with a pain that was part grief and part rage. "Millbrook," the conductor called as the train began to slow. "End of the line." Margaret's heart hammered as she gathered her bag. This was it. Whatever came next, this was where it would begin. She stepped off the train onto a wooden platform that looked like it might collapse under a strong wind. Millbrook was even smaller than she had imagined. One main street with perhaps a dozen buildings, most of them looking abandoned or nearly so. A general store, a saloon, what might have been a hotel, and a few houses scattered among the pine trees. Mountains rose steeply on all sides, making the town feel like it was sitting at the bottom of a green bowl. The other passengers dispersed quickly, knowing exactly where they were going. Within minutes, Margaret stood alone on the platform as the train pulled away, leaving nothing but silence and the smell of pine needles. The October air was sharp and thin, much colder than it had been in Denver. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked toward what she hoped was the hotel. The building had a painted sign that read "Mountain View Inn," though the paint was peeling and one of the windows was boarded up. Margaret pushed through the front door and found herself in a small, dimly lit lobby that smelled of dust and bacon grease. "Help you?" A woman emerged from a back room, wiping her hands on a dirty apron. She was maybe 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and suspicious eyes. "I need a room," Margaret said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The woman looked her up and down, taking in her clean dress and carefully pinned hair. "You sure you got the right place? This ain't exactly a vacation spot." "I'm sure. Rooms are 50 cents a night, meals extra. Payment in advance." Margaret reached into her pouch and counted out the coins. 50 cents for one night meant her money would last less than a month, even if she didn't eat. But she needed time to think, to figure out what to do next. The room was tiny and sparse, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. The window looked out at the mountains, which were already growing dark as evening approached. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and tried not to think about how different this was from the comfortable bedroom she had shared with Edwin. Here, she could hear every sound from the other rooms, every creak of the old building settling around her. Hunger finally forced her downstairs for dinner. The hotel's dining room was a small space with 4 tables, only one of which was occupied. 3 men sat hunched over bowls of what smelled like stew, talking in low voices. They looked up when she entered, and their conversation stopped completely. "Evening," the hotel proprietress said, not particularly friendly, but not hostile either. "Stew's all I got left. Beef and potatoes. $1 for the bowl, and bread." $1. Margaret's heart sank, but she was too hungry to refuse. She took a table as far from the men as possible and ate in silence, trying to ignore their stares and whispered comments. The stew was actually quite good, thick and hearty, but she could barely taste it through her anxiety about the future. "You looking for work?" one of the men asked suddenly. He was younger than the others, maybe 30, with a scraggly beard and clothes that had seen better days. Margaret looked up from her bowl. "Possibly. My cousin runs a place down in Silver Creek. Always looking for entertainment for the miners." The way he said entertainment made Margaret's cheeks burn. She understood exactly what kind of work he was suggesting, and the casualness of it made her feel sick. Was that what people saw when they looked at her now? A desperate woman who would do anything to survive? "I'm not interested," she said firmly. The man shrugged. "Your choice. But options are limited up here for a woman alone." Margaret finished her stew in silence and retreated to her room, her mind racing. She had been naive to think she could just disappear into the mountains and figure things out as she went along. This wasn't Denver, where there were churches and charitable organizations that might help a woman in need. This was the frontier, where survival depended on your own resources and skills. She lay awake most of the night, listening to the sounds of the mountain. Wind through the pines, the distant howl of something that might have been a wolf, the settling of the old building around her. Every noise made her tense. She had never slept anywhere that felt so exposed, so far from help if something went wrong. Morning brought no solutions, only the reality of her dwindling money. After another $1 breakfast of eggs and coffee, she ventured out to explore the town and see if there might be any legitimate work available. The general store was run by an elderly man who seemed genuinely concerned when she asked about employment. "There's not much call for women's work up here," he said kindly. "Most of the men do their own cooking and mending. You might ask at the schoolhouse, but they ain't had a proper teacher in 2 years. Can't pay enough to keep anyone." The schoolhouse turned out to be a one-room log building with broken windows and a roof that had seen better days. Margaret peered through the gaps in the boards that covered the windows and saw chaos inside. Overturned desks, books scattered on the floor, evidence of vandalism or neglect. "Shame, ain't it?" The voice behind her made Margaret jump. She turned to see an older woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "I'm Ruth Morrison. You're the lady who came in on yesterday's train." "Margaret Sullivan," she said, then caught herself. Margaret Thompson. She had no idea why she chose that name, but it felt safer somehow. A fresh start needed a fresh name. Ruth nodded without questioning the slight hesitation. "You thinking about the teaching position? Is it really available?" "Been empty for 2 years now. Last teacher lasted 3 months before he gave up and headed back to civilization. The children here are challenging. Their parents work the mines or trap, and education isn't exactly a priority. Plus, the town can only pay $15 a month, and that's when they can scrape it together." $15 a month was barely enough to survive on, but it was something. And Margaret had always been good with children, even difficult ones. What would it involve exactly? Ruth laughed. Everything. Teaching reading, writing, arithmetic to children aged 6 to 16. Some of them have never seen the inside of a school. Some can't speak proper English. And you'd be expected to clean and maintain the building, organize community events, and probably serve as the town's unofficial mediator when parents disagree about things. It sounded overwhelming, but also like exactly the kind of challenge that might keep her mind off her own problems. Could I see the inside? Margaret asked. Ruth produced a key from her pocket and unlocked the door. The interior was even worse than Margaret had feared. Desks overturned, books with pages torn out, a blackboard so covered in scratches and stains it was barely usable. The pot-bellied stove in the corner looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. Previous teacher left in a hurry, Ruth explained. Some of the older boys can be rough, especially when they don't want to be here. Their parents send them when work is slow, but they'd rather be out trapping or helping in the mines. Margaret walked through the wreckage, imagining what the room could look like with some care and attention. She had always dreamed of teaching, back when she thought her future would involve children of her own to educate and guide. When would I need to start? She asked. Ruth's eyebrows rose in surprise. You're actually considering it? I need work, and this sounds like work that needs doing. Well, Ruth said slowly, the town council meets tonight at the saloon. If you're serious, you could present yourself then. But I have to warn you, they're not particularly progressive about women in positions of authority. Margaret almost laughed at that. After being cast aside by her husband and propositioned by strangers, dealing with a small town council seemed manageable. That evening, Margaret presented herself at the saloon, which doubled as the town's meeting hall. 5 men sat around a table, passing a bottle between them and discussing mining claims and winter preparations. They looked up in surprise when she entered. Gentlemen, she said, using the confident voice she had perfected during 8 years of hosting Edwin's business associates for dinner. I understand you need a teacher. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Margaret had experienced in her sheltered married life. The men were blunt, skeptical, and occasionally crude in their assessment of her qualifications. Could she handle boys bigger than herself who had no respect for authority? Could she survive a winter in the mountains without running back to civilization? Did she understand that she would be essentially on her own, with no support from the outside world for months at a time? Margaret answered each question honestly. No, she had never dealt with truly difficult children, but she was willing to learn. Yes, she understood the isolation, and no, she had nowhere else to go anyway. Yes, she was prepared to commit to staying through the winter, because leaving wasn't really an option. In the end, it was probably her desperation that convinced them more than her qualifications. Someone willing to take the job for $15 a month and stick it out through a mountain winter was better than no teacher at all. You can start Monday, said the man who seemed to be the unofficial leader. But don't expect any help if things go wrong. This town's got enough problems without babysitting a schoolmarm who can't handle the job. Margaret nodded and shook hands with each of them, trying not to show how their rough hands and skeptical looks intimidated her. She was committed now, for better or worse. Over the next few days, she threw herself into preparing the schoolhouse for opening. She scrubbed floors, reorganized desks, and salvaged what books she could from the scattered mess. Ruth Morrison proved to be a valuable ally, helping her understand the dynamics of the families and the challenges she would face. The Mackenzie children are probably your biggest concern, Ruth warned as they sorted through damaged textbooks. 9 of them, ranging from 6 to 16, lost their mother a few months back, and their father. Well, Thomas is a good man, but he's struggling. The older boys have been running wild, and the younger ones barely know how to behave in civilized company. 9 children from one family. Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been anticipation mixed with terror. She had always wanted children, and now she was about to be responsible for teaching dozens of them, including 9 who desperately needed guidance and structure. What happened to their mother? She asked. Ruth's expression grew sad. Died in childbirth. The baby too. Thomas has been trying to manage on his own, but it's too much for any man. The family lives about 5 miles up the mountain, in a cabin that's barely holding together. They come to town maybe once a month for supplies, but mostly they keep to themselves. Margaret nodded, filing away the information. 9 motherless children and a grieving father, isolated in the mountains with winter approaching. It sounded like a recipe for disaster, but it also tugged at something deep in her heart. These children needed help, needed someone who cared enough to make a difference in their lives. On Sunday evening, as Margaret prepared for her first day as a teacher, she felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Denver. Purpose. For the first time in months, she had something meaningful to do, a reason to get up in the morning that went beyond mere survival. She had no idea that tomorrow would bring her face to face with the family that would change everything. She had no idea that 9 grieving, wild, desperate children were about to burst into her carefully ordered new life like a force of nature. And she definitely had no idea that somewhere in a cabin 5 miles up the mountain, a man named Thomas Mackenzie was dreading the start of school almost as much as his children were. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something none of them expected. Tomorrow, the real story would begin. Margaret Sullivan had always believed that marriage was forever. She believed in the promises made before God and witnesses, in the sacred vows that bound 2 people together through sickness and health, for better or worse. But as she stood in the parlor of what had been her home for 8 years, watching her husband Edwin pack her belongings into a single worn carpet bag, she realized that some promises were as fragile as autumn leaves. The morning had started like any other. Margaret had risen before dawn, as was her habit, to prepare Edwin's breakfast and tend to their small garden behind the modest house in Denver. The tomatoes were coming along nicely despite the early October chill, and she had been planning to preserve them for the winter months ahead. Simple domestic tasks that gave her purpose, even though they never filled the aching emptiness that had grown larger with each passing year. Margaret, Edwin's voice cut through her morning routine like a blade. She turned from the stove where she was frying eggs, the same way he liked them every morning for the past 8 years. Runny yolks, crispy edges, with a slice of thick bacon alongside. But something in his tone made her hand freeze on the spatula. He stood in the doorway of their kitchen, fully dressed in his best suit. The navy blue one he wore to church on Sundays and to important business meetings. His dark hair was combed back with pomade, and his mustache was perfectly trimmed. Edwin had always been a handsome man, with strong shoulders and kind brown eyes that had first caught her attention at a church social when she was 23. Those same eyes now looked at her with something she had never seen before. Something cold and final. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the small wooden table where they had shared thousands of meals together, where they had discussed their dreams of the future, their hopes for children, their plans for the life they would build together. Margaret set down the spatula and wiped her hands on her apron. The fabric was worn thin from years of washing, but she had embroidered small blue flowers along the edges when they were first married. Edwin had said they were beautiful then. Now he wouldn't even look at them. "What's wrong?" she asked, though something deep in her stomach already knew. Something had been changing in Edwin for months now. The way he looked at her had shifted. The way he touched her had become perfunctory, almost reluctant. The way he spoke to her had grown shorter, more distant. Edwin reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document. Legal papers. Her heart began to race as he placed them on the table between her breakfast plate and his coffee cup. The same coffee cup she had given him as a wedding gift, painted with tiny roses that had faded over the years. "I've filed for divorce, Margaret." The words hit her like a physical blow. She actually felt the air leave her lungs, felt the kitchen tilt slightly, as if the house had shifted on its foundation. Divorce. The word was shameful, whispered about in parlors and church socials. Something that happened to other women. Fallen women. Women who had somehow failed in their most basic duty. "I don't understand," she whispered, though part of her understood perfectly. Edwin's jaw was set in the stubborn line she had come to know well over the years. When he made up his mind about something, there was no changing it. She had learned that about him early in their marriage, though she had always thought it was a strength. Now it felt like a wall between them. "You know why, Margaret?" "We both know." She did know. They had been trying for children since their wedding night 8 years ago. Month after month, year after year, her body had failed them both. She had visited doctors, tried every remedy suggested by well-meaning friends, relatives, herbal teas that tasted like dirt, strange positions that made her feel foolish, prayers that seemed to echo back from an empty sky. Dr. Patterson had finally given them the verdict 6 months ago, though Margaret suspected they had both known long before then. Some women are simply not made for childbearing, he had said in his matter-of-fact way, as if he were discussing the weather. There's no medical explanation, no treatment. It's simply how the Lord made her. Barren. That's what they called women like her. A word that conjured images of empty fields, of nothing growing, nothing flourishing. A woman who could not fulfill her most basic purpose. Edwin, please, she began, reaching across the table for his hand. He pulled away before she could touch him. I need a wife who can give me children, Margaret. A real wife. The casual cruelty of those words almost doubled her over. A real wife. As if the 8 years she had spent caring for him, cooking for him, washing his clothes, and tending his home meant nothing. As if her love, her devotion, her very existence could be reduced to her ability to bear children. We could adopt, she said desperately. There are orphans who need homes. We could give them love, provide for them. Edwin shook his head firmly. I want my own children, my own blood. A man needs sons to carry on his name, daughters to care for him in his old age. You can't give me that. Margaret felt tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not in front of him. What about our vows? What about in sickness and health? This isn't my fault, Edwin. It's not something I chose. For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. A shadow of the man she had married, the one who had promised to love her forever. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. I've already spoken to Pastor Williams. The papers will be final in 30 days. You'll need to find somewhere else to live. The practicalities hit her like stones. Somewhere else to live. But where? She had no family left. Her parents had died in an influenza outbreak 5 years ago, and her only sister lived in California with a husband who had made it clear that Margaret was not welcome in their home. She had no money of her own. Married women couldn't own property or maintain bank accounts. Everything she thought was theirs belonged only to Edwin. Where am I supposed to go? She asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Edwin reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. The coins inside clinked together as he set it on the table next to the divorce papers. There's $17. It should be enough to get you started somewhere. $17. Less than what Edwin spent on cigars in a month. Less than the cost of one of her Sunday dresses. It was an insulting amount, and they both knew it. Started where? She asked. Doing what? I'm a married woman, Edwin. I don't know how to live any other way. You'll have to learn. The finality in his voice broke something inside her chest. This wasn't a discussion or a negotiation. It was a pronouncement, a judgment that had already been made and carried out. She was being discarded like a broken piece of furniture, something that had served its purpose but was no longer useful. Margaret stood up slowly, her legs shaky beneath her. The kitchen that had been her domain for 8 years suddenly felt foreign. The cast iron stove she had learned to manage, the pantry she kept meticulously organized, the window garden where she grew herbs for cooking. None of it was hers. None of it had ever really been hers. I suppose Mrs. Henderson will be moving in soon, she asked quietly. Edwin's face flushed red, confirming what she had suspected for months. Clara Henderson was a young widow with 2 small children who attended their church. She was 24 years old with blonde curls and a tinkling laugh that made men turn their heads. Most importantly, she had already proven her ability to bear children. Clara understands what marriage means, Edwin said defensively. She knows what a man needs. Margaret nodded slowly. Of course, Clara would give him the sons he wanted, the daughters he demanded. She would fill this house with the sounds Margaret had only dreamed of. Children's laughter, baby cries, the patter of small feet on the wooden floors. The irony was bitter. Margaret had loved children all her life. She had been the one to volunteer at the church nursery, the one who always knew how to calm a crying baby or entertain restless little ones during long sermons. She understood children, connected with them in a way that seemed natural and effortless. But her body refused to create any of her own. I'll pack my things, she said quietly. Edwin nodded and left the room without another word. She could hear his footsteps on the stairs, probably going to their bedroom to make sure she didn't take anything that belonged to him, as if she would steal from the man she had loved faithfully for 8 years. Margaret moved through the house like a ghost, gathering the few possessions that were truly hers. Her mother's silver locket, a few dresses and undergarments, her Bible, with pressed flowers marking her favorite passages, a photograph of her parents taken on their wedding day, the little things that made up a life, all of which fit easily into the single carpet bag Edwin had provided. She paused at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden she would never see harvested. The tomatoes were almost ready, fat and red on the vine. She had planted them with such hope in the spring, imagining canning them for her family's winter meals. Now someone else would enjoy the fruits of her labor. By noon, Margaret Sullivan stood on the porch of what had been her home, carpet bag in one hand and the leather pouch of $17 in the other. Edwin waited by the front door, as if to make sure she actually left, as if she might try to fight for a place where she was no longer wanted. "Where will you go?" he asked, and for a moment she thought she heard something almost like concern in his voice. "I don't know," she answered truthfully. She walked down the front path she had swept clean countless times, past the fence she had painted white every spring, away from the only life she had ever known. At the corner, she turned back once to look at the house. Edwin was still standing in the doorway, but he wasn't watching her leave. He was looking down the street in the other direction, probably waiting for Clara Henderson to arrive with her children and her proven fertility. Margaret turned away and kept walking, her feet automatically carrying her toward the train station. She had no destination in mind, no plan beyond getting as far away as possible. The October wind whipped around her skirts and stung her cheeks, but she barely felt it. She was numb, hollowed out, empty as the barren womb that had cost her everything. At the train station, she studied the departures board with growing desperation. Where did a woman go when she had nowhere to go? The cities were expensive, and $17 wouldn't last long. The smaller towns might offer work, but what kind of work could a divorced woman find? She had no skills beyond housekeeping and cooking, and those were talents expected of any decent woman, not something she could earn money doing. Her eyes settled on a name that seemed to call to her: Millbrook, Colorado. A tiny mountain town she had never heard of, probably nothing more than a mining settlement. But the train ticket cost only $3, which would leave her with 14 to start over. And there was something appealing about disappearing into the mountains, away from the judgmental eyes of civilized society. The train pulled into the station with a great huffing of steam and screeching of brakes. Margaret climbed aboard with her single bag, finding a seat by the window. As Denver disappeared behind her in a haze of smoke and autumn mist, she tried to imagine what lay ahead. She had no way of knowing that her destination wasn't really Millbrook at all, but a place much harder to find and infinitely more valuable. She was traveling toward a destiny that would transform not just her own life, but the lives of 9 children who desperately needed what she had always had to give. She was traveling toward a love deeper than marriage vows, toward a purpose greater than her own pain. But first, she would have to survive being completely and utterly alone for the first time in her life. And in the harsh mountains of Colorado, survival was never guaranteed. In the harsh winter of 1892, when the wind howled through the Colorado mountains like a wounded animal, a woman stood at the edge of everything she had ever known. Her husband's final words still echoed in her mind. "A wife who cannot bear children is no wife at all." The divorce papers in her trembling hands felt heavier than the snow-laden branches above her head. At 32, Margaret Sullivan had been declared worthless by society's cruel standards. Cast out from her marriage, shunned by her community, and left with nothing but the clothes on her back and $17 sewn into her coat lining. But what she didn't know was that somewhere in those same treacherous mountains, a widowed man named Thomas Mackenzie was desperately praying for a miracle. His 9 children, orphaned by their mother's death in childbirth just 3 months earlier, were slowly starving in a cabin that felt more like a tomb than a home. 2 broken souls, separated by miles of frozen wilderness, were about to discover that sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as its cruelest rejections. This is the story of how a woman deemed barren would become the mother of 9 children she never bore, and how a man who had lost everything would find his salvation in the most unexpected place.